Hello, welcome. Smart's here. Thank you for coming back to my channel. If this is your first time here, I bid thee welcome. There is a subscribe button below if you would like to help support my channel by subscribing. Also a bell to be notified as to when I upload more content. I'm coming to you from Ghana country, and as such, I acknowledge the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains as being the traditional custodians of the lands upon which I reside. So if you've been following my channel for a little while, you may notice that I've been doing some videos about just some things that are really sort of getting under my skin these days, especially within some magical witchcraft circles. And this is going to be another of those videos. And there's underlying, I think, themes to why it's getting under my skin. And I think there's a flow-on effect as well. One of the reasons is we seem to have, especially in occult circles, this anything goes attitude. And it seems to be devoid of any personal responsibility. It's almost similar here in Australia. We have this saying, she'll be right, mate. Which sort of irks me a bit. And then we have something that's a bit wider spread, and I guess it's a sort of side effect of social media or how we're receiving our information these days. And that tends to be more of a dumbing down of the population in general. Now, I really don't like this anything goes attitude. I know I can be in a minority about it because there are definitely situations and circumstances where anything simply does not go. And it also tends to have this avoidance of responsibility, especially when it comes on to the flow-on effect. And this occurs regardless of whether we are personally responsible for our actions or not, or it could be our inactions. And all of this actually adds up to things. And the connection with this with magic is that this is really one of the sort of underlying philosophies, I guess, that is, it's part of the threads that I relate to, that sort of metaphysical, esoteric, but also flows through magic and witchcraft. So none of these things are separate when it comes down to sort of taking personal responsibility and being aware of our actions. And then that flows into our daily life as to how we interact with others and also being part of the great cosmic whole as well. And this is because nothing is without consequence. Unless, of course, you live in a vacuum, and I know I don't. And as I said, it has a flow-on effect, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. And when I start thinking about these things, about people sort of being devoiding of responsibility or misquoting stuff because they haven't researched something properly, a really good example or quote in particular comes to mind, and you've probably heard of it. It says, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And often that quote is attributed to Edmund Burke, who was an Irish statesman. However, as things actually go, Burke never actually said that. And at best, I guess the essence of this quote could be traced back to a Unitarian philosopher by the name of John Stuart Mill in an inaugural address that he delivered in 1867 at the University of St. Andrews, where he stated, "Let not anyone pacify his conscience by the delusion that he can do no harm if he takes no part and forms no opinion. Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing. He is not a good man who, without a protest, allows wrong to be committed in his name, and with the means which he helps to supply, because he will not trouble himself to use his mind on the subject." And I'll put the link to the quote below. what I find interesting is what Burke himself has been attributed to having said is a summary or an assumption even of Milne, thus cutting Milne out of the whole creditation. So while we are not directly discrediting Milne, we may be completely ignorant of the fact that he existed. And I know I did until I started investigating as to who originated this quote. Therefore, it's our inaction up to that point, my inactions, that have added really to the discreditation of Milne, because I've used this quote on a number of times, thinking that it belonged to Burke, and it didn't. So am I making a mountain out of a molehill, and what exactly is this molehill that I'm expanding upon? I guess it's coming back to our day and age of all this instant information. And again, it's a double-edged sword, because it's getting to have less or fewer and fewer excuses not to research material. We've got so much information available today. It's at our fingertips. However, it's almost like our researching abilities have had to change, because where we need to apply due diligence is for sorting out the fact from the fiction. And that's becoming increasingly challenging. So instead of passing something off merely as a fact, we need to research. And we also need to sort of take a step back and hold our tongue, especially when someone points out to us that what we thought was fact was actually not. And I do believe that jumping on this anything goes bandwagon is really hardly a decent excuse. It's certainly not depicting any adult responsibilities, probably more so within the magical communities, who from my point of view especially, really should know better, because as I said, this is part of what used to be my sort of foundational training in philosophies. Don't trust anything that's been handed down to you. Do your own research. Try it, test it. Only then do you trust it. So coming to the topic of this video, which is about moon names, this is a really good example, because we're seeing this increasing, or what I'm considering to be increasing overuse of moon names that allegedly stem from American folklore traditions or a part thereof. So much so that even mainstream media here in Australia are parroting these moon names. And while this may not mean anything for those in America, here in Australia, like I guess other places south of the equator, it's a rather annoying sign just how mainstream, I guess, the media simply doesn't get it. But they're trying to sort of join the in-call club, because everybody's cool about witchcraft. And it's also the increasing number of witches or pagans or other folk who don't seem to get why they shouldn't be parroting these moon names off the internet. Because if they did a little bit of research, they will understand or soon realize that these moon names really aren't all that they are allegedly about. Now, I'm not saying that I know everything, but I do know some things, because I've written a book which took me about 10 years to write about the moon. And I also mentioned it in my first book, Dancing the Sacred Wheel, as well. And that took another 10 years to write. Firstly, looking at the moon names. The use of these moon names actually originally referred to the whole lunation of the moon, not just the full moon. So whether that was from new moon to new moon or full moon to full moon, I think that depended on the people. Also, it's interesting to note that not everyone or every Indigenous culture around the world observed specific moon names. As far as I'm aware, in Australia, in particular, the Kaurna people didn't. I can be corrected. If you do know something contrary, please put your comments below and I can investigate it. But as far as I'm aware, the Kaurna people didn't really spend time or use that calendar, the moon as a calendar, as in sort of a marking of time. They were more sort of seasonally orientated. But again, I'm not an expert in that. We have lost a lot of information in relation to the Kaurna peoples due to when the English arrived and the white pox, I think, moved down the Murray River and almost annihilated the population. But as years go on, they are beginning to reclaim more and more stuff or remember more and more of their sacred law, which is fantastic. So it wasn't like one size sort of fits all. Secondly, the more common names that are being sort of bandied about, especially on the internet, come from a specific area in the US. So they're not blanket terms. Outside that specific tribe or that area, other names would also be used. Some of these names have actually been sort of blended in by the trappers. So these were people who, especially the white people, who were trapping animals and selling their pelts. Other Indigenous peoples around the world had their own names. The Celts had names. They also had their own or various alphabets. A lot of these are sort of connected in with the moon. The Norse also had their own names for the moon. The Chinese also have their own names for the moon, and they still sort of have use or acknowledge certain moons to this day. So why should you listen to someone like me? I'm personally, so I put it out there, I'm not against using names for the full moon. I actually think it's sort of, I wouldn't say cute, but yeah, it's not bad. It doesn't sort of upset me that much. What does annoy me is this parroting fashion where this parroting fashion because it sort of is devoid of any understanding as to how these names came about. And especially when you're living in an environment, and this is my point, where these names do not fit. But you're using them just the same as some parroting fashion because you want to be part of the in crowd or to be cool. Because everybody's calling, in particular, say the April moon as the pink moon. And this is something that I heard last month, and I'm sitting there going, oh my God, here we are all over again. And then I'm going on to the ABC web page, going on to there. So they've got a star and astrological section or astronomical section there. And their writer, their expert, is calling it a pink moon, clearly without any understanding why it's called a pink moon. As I've mentioned in my books, it's a pink moon because in America, especially in the eastern states, there is a specific flower, the phlox flower, that's pink, that becomes into bloom in April because in the Northern Hemisphere and in that part of America, this is spring. Here in the Southern Hemisphere, April is not spring. We don't have pink flowers. We might still have pink flowers, but we don't have the phlox flower. It's coming to light. I don't even know if it's the phlox flower is actually a wildflower. It could be something like that even. But this is where that name originated from. So instead of blindly copying something from the internet because it appears cool, and tying into my sort of grievance at the beginning of this anything goes attitude, I am very surprised that the Anything Goes crowd isn't coming up with their own names, isn't encouraging people to start using their own, can I say, intelligence to look to their own environment to see what is happening and therefore call the moon after that name. Don't even have to use the whole cycle, even if you just want to focus on the full moon. What's happening in your local environment in April? Because I know here in Adelaide, we don't get the phlox flower springing to life. And when mainstream media in particular then have taken this and are running with it, I think that's a really good sign to sort of all think it's going a little bit too mainstream. And also when you are merely parroting something to me or to maybe other experienced or more experienced practitioners, it can be seen like you're not really serious. And I'll sort of unpack it a little bit more because the craft in particular or magic is all about changing you. It's about transformation. It's also, especially when you're looking at the craft, it's connected so much in with the earth, even though there are some people who don't like to call it an earth-based religion or spirituality. There is, I call it earth-centric because we do work with the seasons and we do work with the phases of the moon, and all of these sort of have an interconnectedness to how we perceive our world and do our magics, well, either waxing or waning, regardless of the moon phase, but also on a larger scale throughout the year. And that, when we get into that cycle, we connect ourselves in with the greater scheme of things. And we understand that when we work our magics, we're more aligned with what is happening around us. We're tapping into those energies. And that enhances our magic. That enables us to simulate more with the energies around us. So we're no longer sort of battering uphill. And that in turn connects us more in with the earth, which in this modern society where we're so head-driven, I think is more and more important. It connects us also in with our body, and it helps our soul through its transformation as we're moving away from sort of a reliance on external forces to understand what is happening within us. So, for example, I know I was talking about the April moon being a pink moon. Here in Australia, I'm just sort of thinking, what is happening around in my local environment at that time? At the end of the month, end of April, of course, it's Samhain. It is Anzac Day. It's supposed to be the beginning of autumn or winter. We've got that portal moving into the darker half of the year. So a good name for me is Ancestor Moon. Even if it doesn't feel like this year, it doesn't feel like we've sort of stepped across that threshold into winter, not yet. March is fantastic here because the sort of like harvest moon does resonate. Where I live, we have the grape harvests of the Barossa Valley and all the other wine areas being harvested around, especially around the autumn equinox. So it can be the harvest moon. November is another good example because that's the time when the jacaranda trees are in flower. And even though the jacarandas are, I think, indigenous from South Africa, there's parts of Adelaide, especially in the older suburbs, where they have these avenues of jacarandas. And it's usually around November that they all are in flower. And because they got these delicate little lilac flowers that carpet the ground as well, and a beautiful, delicate scent in the air. So I call November Jacaranda moon, if I use the term as well. I am very comfortable of calling the moons after the months, May moon, April moon, November moon. But if you want to align a specific name to it, this is my sort of like question to you. Why are you calling it these American so-called trapper or folkloric moons? Especially if you are outside that area. Calling something a sturgeon moon or a bear moon or a wolf moon, and you're living in Australia, for example, to me is ironic. We don't have sturgeons, we don't have bears, we don't have wolves. Some places we don't even have snow to call, say, the June moon snow. But we do have other things. February, another good example, could be bushfire moon or fire moon, because that's the time when often, though more recent times, things have sort of changed a little bit, but often February is the time where it's our hottest month. So we're sort of on higher bushfire alert here. There are parts of the country, especially with Indigenous peoples, when we're looking at their seasons, some of their seasons would only last a couple of weeks because they were really connected into their natural observances. There was a season, I think it's the peoples in the Northern Territory, knocking down moon, or knocking down season. And that was the time when these huge winds would come through. It would only last a couple of weeks, but that season formed part of their calendar. And another reason why I feel this is important, because it, again, as I said, it helps you earth yourself into your environment, which in turns, if you're practicing magic or you're wanting to get in tune with we call them tides, phases of the moon, the seasons, also now understanding the ebbing and flowing nature of what's happening in our local environment. But I guess at the end of the day, the choice is up to you. You don't have to listen to an old bat like myself, sort of having a little bit of a whinge that people are just parroting moon names and everything. I do find it interesting that in this anything goes society, that people are so quick to almost conform in certain areas due to maybe an influencer saying something, regardless of where that has come from. And yes, I know it's a little bit difficult these days with there's so much information out there. But back in my day, we didn't have that information. We had to use our tenacity to search and also to test the information that we receive. That testing, that using our own logic still applies today. Just that the searching is a little bit harder because you're getting more and more information being thrown at you. So if you don't live in the Americas or in certain states of America, looking at the moon names, which are quite easily bandied about, and also in this day and age as fact, 9 times out of 10, they're not fact. Like they're not sort of one size fits all. Take any information and then sit with it. If it's seasonal, if it's environmental, does it still relate to where you are? If we're in this anything goes attitude, society, craft, magic, then why are you following someone else's direction when it doesn't relate? I find that also interesting, especially from people who sort of turn their nose up or discredit so the founders of various magics or traditions, calling them sort of ill-informed or controlling, yet they're doing the very same thing from the social media, aren't they? From their influencers, taking on something and not testing it. So it's just something to give some thought to it. If you want to use the trapper names, the American folk names, knock yourself out. I just find it a bit discrediting. Well, but when social media terms are now taken up by mainstream media, to me, that is sort of a red flag. It's time to get out of here. When daytime television is now talking about the pink moon, and we know that majority of those presenters are, it's not say idiots, but that's just my personal opinion. When they're starting to use it, I think it's time to move on to the next thing. This is my opinion. Like this whole channel is my opinion. If you don't agree, that's fine. If you do agree, good. Unless I know I'm not alone. If you do know more about the Ghana people or the Indigenous peoples in Australia in relation to if they actually followed the moon, I know, and I'm talking about more than just using them for navigation. I'm talking about actually having specific sort of seasons or seasonal names or connecting phases of the moon specifically. I'll be very much interested. People comments below or link to the sites if you find any information, because as far as I'm aware of, they don't or didn't. Well, this is not an area that I'm a complete expert on. So, and if you have enjoyed this content, yeah, might consider subscribing. Anyway, blessings.